It was a quiet Thursday evening when she told me. We were sitting in our living room, the soft hum of the TV playing a rerun of some sitcom we weren't paying attention to. Sarah had been unusually quiet that week, her usual bubbly energy muted by something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a storm of nerves. I muted the TV and turned to her, curious but not alarmed. In our 8 years of marriage, we had shared just about everything, from childhood secrets to dreams we barely dared to believe in. "I'm bisexual," she said, the words landing softly but reverberating through the room like a thunderclap. I blinked, unsure how to respond. Her words were simple, but their implications felt monumental. My mind raced, trying to process what this meant for us. For her. For me. "Okay," I said finally, my voice steady though my heart pounded. "Thank you for telling me." It felt like the right thing to say, supportive, neutral, open. But inside, I was a tangle of questions. She looked relieved but hesitant, her hands twisting the hem of her shirt. "I've known for a long time, even before we got married. But I've only just started to feel like I could admit it. To myself, and to you." I nodded, still grasping for solid ground. "Does this change anything between us?" The question escaped before I could stop it, my fear slipping through. She shook her head quickly, her eyes wide and earnest. "No. I love you. That hasn't changed. It's just, this part of me is real too, and I needed you to know." I took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you for trusting me with this. I'm here for you, whatever you need." I meant it, even though a knot of unease had settled in my stomach. We sat in silence for a while, her confession hanging between us. It felt like a new chapter, but I wasn't sure if it was the beginning of something beautiful or the prelude to an ending. The days after Sarah's revelation felt oddly normal, yet undeniably different. She assured me that nothing about our marriage was in jeopardy, and for the most part, I believed her. But her words had planted a seed in my mind, one that sprouted questions I couldn't stop asking myself. Did this mean she had been suppressing part of who she was for years? Had I unknowingly been a barrier to her true happiness? And most unsettling of all, what if this part of her grew too big to coexist with us? I pushed the thoughts away, trying to focus on being supportive. Sarah, for her part, seemed lighter, freer, as though a weight she'd been carrying had finally been set down. She began opening up about things she'd never talked about before, crushes on girls in high school, fleeting thoughts during college that she'd dismissed as phases. It was like I was getting to know her all over again, a version of her that had been hidden even from herself. At first, I welcomed the honesty. It felt like we were closer than ever, peeling back layers we'd never explored. But as weeks turned into months, I started noticing subtle shifts. Sarah had always been sociable, but now her social calendar seemed fuller than ever. Book clubs, trivia nights, happy hours with new friends I hadn't met. When I asked about them, she was always forthcoming, her explanations breezy and casual. "Oh, that's with Harper and the group from yoga," she'd say, or, "Melissa invited me out after class. She's got the best stories, you'd love her." And I believed her. Why wouldn't I? But there was a growing sense of unease I couldn't shake, a nagging feeling that I was standing still while Sarah was running ahead into a world I didn't recognize. One evening, she came home late from a night out. I was already in bed, half asleep but awake enough to hear the soft click of the door and the muffled sound of her heels on the floor. She slipped into bed beside me, her perfume lingering in the air, and I felt her hesitate before settling in. "Good night," she whispered, but her voice carried something unspoken. "Good night," I replied, but my chest tightened with the weight of questions I couldn't ask. Was I being paranoid? Or was there something slipping through my fingers, something I couldn't name yet? The next morning, over coffee, I decided to speak up. "You've been going out a lot lately," I said, trying to sound casual. "Making a lot of new friends, huh? She smiled, her expression open and unbothered. Yeah, I guess I have. It's been nice, you know. Meeting people who get me in a different way. A pang of jealousy flared, sharp and unwelcome. What do you mean? Her smile faltered slightly. Just, people who've had similar experiences. It's comforting to feel understood like that. But it's not like I'm leaving you out. You're still my person. Her words were meant to reassure, but they only left me more unsettled. She said I was her person, but why did it feel like I was slowly becoming a shadow in her life? I sipped my coffee, forcing a smile. I'm glad you're finding that. Just, don't forget about us, okay? She reached across the table, her hand warm against mine. I could never forget about us, she said, her eyes earnest. And for a moment, I believed her. But the doubt lingered, unspoken and unresolved. A few more months passed, and Sarah's transformation only deepened. She had a newfound energy, a brightness that radiated from her in a way that was both beautiful and unsettling. It was hard not to notice how much time she was spending with her new friends, especially one name that seemed to come up more and more frequently, Harper. Harper was a yoga instructor, a fact I'd heard Sarah mention several times. From the bits and pieces Sarah shared, I'd gathered that Harper was confident, charismatic, and unapologetically herself, someone who had embraced her identity with a boldness Sarah seemed to admire. Harper was also, it seemed, a near-constant presence in Sarah's life. Harper and I went for coffee after class today, Sarah would say casually, or, Harper suggested this great book, I think you'd like it too. At first, I dismissed it as nothing more than a new friendship. But as Sarah spent more evenings out, more weekends occupied by plans with Harper, I couldn't help but feel the distance growing between us. I told myself I was being irrational. She'd promised that nothing between us had changed, and I wanted desperately to believe her. One Saturday evening, I decided to ask her directly. She was getting ready to go out again, standing in front of the mirror as she adjusted a pair of earrings I'd never seen before. She looked stunning, her dress hugging her in all the right places, her smile radiant as she hummed along to a song on the radio. Another night out with Harper? I asked, my voice carefully neutral. She glanced at me in the mirror, her expression unreadable. Yeah, we're going to that new wine bar downtown. She's been dying to check it out. I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. You've been spending a lot of time with her. Sarah turned to face me, her brow furrowing slightly. Is that a problem? I shook my head quickly, not wanting to push too hard. No, I miss us. It feels like we haven't had much time together lately. Her face softened, and she stepped closer, taking my hand in hers. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you feel like that. I've just been figuring some things out, you know. Harper's been a really good friend through all of this. I nodded, though her words only deepened my unease. What was she figuring out that she couldn't share with me? Maybe we could have a night to ourselves soon, I suggested, hoping to bridge the gap between us. Just the two of us, like old times. She smiled, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, guilt, maybe, or hesitation. Yeah, she said softly. We'll do that. Soon. But soon never seemed to come. Weeks went by, and her nights out continued. The gap between us grew wider, and no matter how hard I tried to reach across it, I felt like she was slipping further away. One night, after she came home late again, I found myself awake in the darkness, staring at the ceiling as she slept beside me. I could hear her soft, steady breathing, but the closeness we'd once shared felt like a distant memory. I wanted to ask her about Harper, about what she was feeling, about us, but fear held me back. Instead, I lay there, wondering when our marriage had become a house of cards, and how long it would be before it all came crashing down. The distance between us was no longer subtle. It had become a tangible thing, filling the space in our home like an invisible fog. Sarah's laughter, which used to echo through the house, was now rare and often reserved for someone else, someone on the other end of her phone. Her messages pinged frequently, and though she didn't hide her screen, she no longer went out of her way to share what was on it either. One evening, she left her phone on the kitchen counter while she showered. It wasn't something she did often, and I didn't plan to snoop, I truly didn't. But as I walked by and saw Harper's name flash across the screen, accompanied by a message that read, "Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you," I froze. My heart pounded, the words searing themselves into my mind. I stared at the phone, my stomach twisting. I felt a wave of shame for even reading the message, but the knot in my chest wouldn't loosen. I couldn't pretend this wasn't happening anymore. When Sarah came back into the kitchen, I was seated at the table, the phone turned face down in front of me. She stopped mid-stride, her hair damp and her cheeks flushed from the shower, and her eyes flicked to the phone immediately. There was a brief pause, barely perceptible, but I saw it, the tiniest shift in her expression before she smiled at me. "You okay?" she asked, grabbing a glass of water like nothing was wrong. I nodded stiffly, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. "Sarah," I started, my voice strained, "is there something you're not telling me? About Harper?" Her hand froze halfway to her lips. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Finally, she set the glass down and sat across from me. "What do you mean?" she asked, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "You've been spending a lot of time with her. And I saw the message she sent. About last night." Her eyes widened slightly, and she looked down at her hands. The color drained from her face, and I knew, in that moment, that I wasn't imagining things. Whatever I had feared was happening was already real. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I didn't plan it, I swear. But Harper makes me feel things I didn't know I could feel. Things I can't ignore." My breath caught in my throat. "What about us, Sarah? What about everything we've built together? Do I not make you feel those things anymore?" She looked up at me, tears welling in her eyes. "It's not about you not being enough. You are. You've always been more than enough. But this is about me. About figuring out who I am and what I need." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt a surge of anger, hurt, and confusion all at once. "You're married to me, Sarah. You made vows. Did those mean nothing to you?" She flinched, her tears spilling over. "Of course they meant something. They still do. But I can't keep pretending I'm okay when I'm not. I love you, but I'm not in love with you the way I used to be. And I don't think I can get that back." The weight of her words crushed me. I pushed my chair back and stood, needing space, air, anything to escape the suffocating pain. "So, what now?" I asked, my voice hollow. "Are you leaving me for her?" She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I don't know. I just know I can't keep living like this." I turned away, unable to look at her anymore. The woman I loved, the woman I thought I'd spend my life with, had already drifted away. And I didn't know how to bring her back, or if she even wanted to be brought back at all. The days following that conversation felt like a blur. Sarah didn't leave right away, but the air between us was thick with unspoken words. We navigated around each other carefully, exchanging the bare minimum to keep up appearances. It was agonizing, like waiting for a storm to finally hit after the first flash of lightning had lit up the sky. Sarah was home less and less, her nights out growing longer, her mornings quieter. When she was around, she would offer small gestures of kindness, making my coffee the way I liked it, asking about my day, but they felt hollow. The bond between us was fraying, and no matter how tightly I tried to hold on, the thread slipped through my fingers. One Saturday afternoon, I returned home to find her packing a bag. The sight stopped me in my tracks. The closet doors were open, and a pile of neatly folded clothes sat on the bed. She turned when she heard me, her face a mix of guilt and resolve. "I think it's time," she said softly, her voice steady but her eyes glistening with unshed tears. My chest tightened. "Time for what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "To leave," she said, her hands gripping the edge of the suitcase. "This isn't fair to either of us. I've tried to ignore how I feel, but it's not going away. Staying here, pretending things can go back to the way they were, it's just hurting both of us." I stepped closer, my voice rising despite myself. "You're not even giving us a chance, Sarah. You're running away from this, from me." She flinched but didn't back down. "I'm not running away. I've spent months trying to figure out what's right. And as much as it hurts, I know staying isn't it. I love you, but I can't be the wife you deserve anymore." Her words were like a dagger, twisting deep. "And what about her?" I spat, unable to stop myself. "Are you leaving me for Harper?" She hesitated, and in that pause, I had my answer. She looked down at the suitcase, her fingers fidgeting with the zipper. "Harper isn't the reason I'm leaving," she said finally. "But she made me realize something I can't ignore. I've been hiding a part of myself my whole life. I need to be honest about who I am, even if it's messy. Even if it means letting go of this." I sank onto the edge of the bed, my hands gripping my hair. The weight of her decision was crushing, and I felt powerless to stop it. "You said you loved me," I said, my voice breaking. "Was that a lie?" She knelt in front of me, her hands reaching for mine. "I did love you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I still do. But it's not the kind of love you deserve. You deserve someone who can give you everything, and I can't do that anymore." Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. I wanted to scream, to beg her to stay, to find some way to undo everything that had led us here. But deep down, I knew it was over. The woman who had been my partner, my best friend, was no longer mine to hold on to. She stood, picking up her suitcase. "I'm going to stay with Harper for a while," she said quietly. "I need space to figure things out." I couldn't bring myself to look at her. "Just go," I muttered, my voice flat. "Do whatever you need to do." I heard her footsteps retreat, the soft click of the door as it closed behind her. And then I was alone, the silence of the house pressing in on me like a weight I could barely bear. In the weeks following Sarah's departure, the house felt hollow. Everywhere I looked, there were traces of her, her favorite coffee mug on the counter, the scarf she always draped over the back of the chair, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the bedroom. Each reminder was like a fresh wound, a sharp reminder of what I had lost. I threw myself into work, hoping the long hours would dull the ache. But even in the midst of meetings and projects, my thoughts would wander back to her. I replayed our last conversation over and over, dissecting every word, searching for some missed opportunity to change the outcome. I considered calling her, asking her to come back. But what would I even say? She had been so resolute, so certain in her decision. And as much as I hated to admit it, part of me knew she was right. Holding on to a version of us that no longer existed would only prolong the pain. Harper was a name I couldn't escape. Mutual friends, trying to tiptoe around the subject, would let it slip that Sarah had been seen out with her, at a cafe, at a park, laughing and carefree. The thought of them together sent a fresh wave of hurt through me, but also confusion. Was this who Sarah had been all along? Had I been blind to the truth of who she was, or had she simply changed in a way I couldn't keep up with? One night, after too many beers and a particularly bleak spiral of self-pity, I decided to text her. The words came slowly, each one feeling heavier than the last. "Me, I hope you're doing okay. The house feels empty without you." I stared at the screen, unsure if I even wanted a response. When her reply came, it was brief but kind. "Sarah, I'm okay. I hope you're taking care of yourself. The polite distance in her words stung, but what else could I expect? She had moved on, while I was still here, picking up the shattered pieces of our life together. One evening, I ran into an old friend, Kevin, at the grocery store. He was one of those people who seem to exude effortless confidence, and he greeted me with a hearty slap on the back. "Hey, man, long time no see. How's Sarah?" he asked, his grin faltering when he saw the look on my face. "She's not around anymore," I said, trying to sound casual. "We're separated." Kevin winced. "Sorry to hear that. You okay?" I shrugged, suddenly aware of how tired I must look. "I'm getting through it. One day at a time." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You should come out with us sometime. A bunch of us are hitting up that new brewery this weekend. Might do you some good." I hesitated, tempted to decline and retreat back to my cocoon of solitude. But something in his tone, the genuine concern, made me agree. "Yeah, maybe. Thanks." That weekend, I joined Kevin and his friends at the brewery. It was the first time in weeks that I felt like I could breathe again, even if just for a little while. The beer flowed, the conversation was light, and for a few hours, I wasn't the guy whose wife left him, I was just Jake, laughing at dumb jokes and rediscovering what it felt like to enjoy myself. When I got home that night, the house was still empty, but it didn't feel quite as suffocating. For the first time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I could survive this. The slow process of rebuilding my life began to feel less like a punishment and more like a challenge. I took Kevin up on his invitations more often, venturing out to dinners, hikes, and even a trivia night at the bar. Each outing was a small step forward, a way to remind myself that there was life beyond the walls of my empty house. But no matter how much I tried to move on, Sarah lingered in the corners of my mind. It wasn't just her absence, it was the questions she left behind. How had we gone from planning our future to living separate lives? And why couldn't I let go of the hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end? One evening, as I scrolled aimlessly through my phone, I stumbled across old photos of us. Vacations, lazy Sundays, the countless little moments that made up our life together. I couldn't help but smile at the memory of her laugh, the way she scrunched her nose when she was concentrating. But the smile faded quickly, replaced by a dull ache. I was debating whether to delete the photos or keep them when a text from Sarah popped up on my screen. "Sarah, hey. Can we talk soon?" I stared at the message, my heart racing. It was the first time she had reached out to me since she left. What did she want to talk about? Was she regretting her decision, or was this something else entirely? After a moment's hesitation, I typed back. "Me, sure. When?" She responded quickly. "Sarah, tomorrow evening. I can come by." The next day was a haze of nerves and anticipation. I cleaned the house obsessively, arranging pillows, wiping down counters, even lighting a candle as though preparing for a dinner date. By the time evening came, I was exhausted but determined to keep my emotions in check. When Sarah arrived, she looked different. Her hair was shorter, her clothes more casual than I was used to seeing her in. She smiled softly when I opened the door, but there was a tension in her posture, a carefulness in the way she carried herself. "Hi," she said. "Hi," I replied, stepping aside to let her in. We sat at the kitchen table, an awkward silence stretching between us before she finally spoke. "I wanted to see how you were doing," she said, her hands wrapped around the mug of tea I had made her. "It's been a lot, hasn't it?" I nodded, unsure how to respond. "It has. But I'm managing." She hesitated, then sighed. "I've been thinking about us. About everything that happened. And I wanted to tell you. I'm sorry. For how it all went down. For hurting you." Her words were sincere, but they didn't bring the relief I thought they would. "Why now?" I asked, my voice low. What made you want to say this? She looked down at her mug, her expression unreadable. Because I care about you. I always will. And because I need you to know that leaving wasn't about you not being enough. It was about me finally being honest with myself. I swallowed hard, her words reopening old wounds. And Harper? Is she? She's part of my life now, Sarah admitted, her voice steady but soft. I'm happy with her, Jake. Happier than I've been in a long time. And I want that for you too. I want you to find someone who makes you feel alive. The finality of her words was like a punch to the gut, but I nodded, forcing a small smile. I want that too, I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. We talked for a while longer, the conversation meandering through memories and reflections. By the time she left, I felt a strange sense of closure. The pain was still there, but it was quieter now, less sharp. I realized that Sarah had given me something I hadn't expected, permission to let go. As I stood in the doorway watching her walk away, I took a deep breath and whispered to myself, it's time to move forward. After Sarah's visit, the house felt different. The silence wasn't as suffocating as before, and the shadows of what had been no longer loomed quite so large. Her words, though bittersweet, had given me clarity. She wasn't coming back, and holding on to the idea of us would only keep me anchored to a life that no longer existed. I poured my energy into change. I rearranged the furniture, painted the bedroom a color I'd never considered before, navy blue, and even got a dog, a golden retriever puppy I named Max. Max had a knack for sensing my moods, his goofy antics pulling me out of my head when I started to spiral. He became my constant companion, filling the void in a way I hadn't expected. Kevin and his group continued to pull me out of my comfort zone. One evening, he introduced me to a friend of his named Emma. She was warm and easy to talk to, her laughter infectious. We hit it off immediately, trading stories about bad dates and awkward family dinners. By the end of the night, she had given me her number. I hesitated before texting her, afraid of what starting something new might mean. But Sarah's voice echoed in my mind, I want you to find someone who makes you feel alive. For the first time, I allowed myself to wonder if Emma could be that person. Our first date was simple, a walk in the park with Max bounding ahead of us, his leash dragging behind as he chased squirrels. Emma laughed at his antics, her smile lighting up her face in a way that made my chest feel lighter. You've got a great dog, she said, crouching to scratch behind Max's ears. He's got your energy. I raised an eyebrow. You mean clumsy and overly enthusiastic? She grinned. I was going to say loyal and full of life, but sure, let's go with that. We spent hours walking and talking, the conversation flowing effortlessly. Emma was curious and open, her questions probing but never invasive. She had a way of making me feel seen, something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. When the date ended, I found myself reluctant to say goodbye. I'd like to see you again, I said, surprising even myself with the confidence in my voice. Emma smiled, her cheeks flushing slightly. I'd like that too. As the weeks turned into months, Emma became a steady presence in my life. She was patient, never pushing me to share more than I was ready to, but always there when I needed someone to talk to. She listened when I told her about Sarah, about the heartbreak and the healing, and never once made me feel judged. One evening, as we sat on my couch with Max snoring at our feet, she asked a question that caught me off guard. Do you think you're ready to move on? Not just from Sarah, but everything. I stared at her for a moment, her gaze steady but kind. The question lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. And for the first time, I realized the answer wasn't as complicated as I thought. I think I am, I said softly. Because of you. Her smile was radiant, and when she leaned in to kiss me, it felt like the first real breath I'd taken in months. The relationship with Emma felt different, simpler, lighter, and grounded in honesty. She didn't demand anything from me, but she gave me the space to explore who I was beyond the shadow of what had happened with Sarah. With her, I wasn't defined by my past but by the person I was becoming. We fell into an easy rhythm. Emma became a regular fixture in my life, and Max adored her, often curling up at her feet or trying to wedge himself between us on the couch. It was impossible to feel weighed down by the past when she was around, her laughter and warmth filling the spaces that had once felt empty. But moving on wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when memories of Sarah would sneak up on me, a song we used to dance to, a restaurant we'd frequented, or a random joke she would have found funny. Each memory was like a small tug backward, a reminder of what had been. I tried not to let those moments consume me, but occasionally, they left me questioning whether I was truly ready for this new chapter. One evening, Emma noticed my silence as we sat on the porch, the sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. "You're thinking about her, aren't you?" she asked gently. I nodded, appreciating her perceptiveness. "Sometimes it feels like I'm betraying what we had by moving on," I admitted. "Even though I know it's what she wanted." Emma reached for my hand, her fingers warm and steady. "You're not betraying her, Jake. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It just means making room for something new. For someone new." Her words resonated, and for the first time, I began to see my memories of Sarah not as weights pulling me down but as markers of a chapter that had shaped me. They didn't have to define my future. One day, months after our last conversation, Sarah texted me. It was brief, just a few lines asking how I was and sharing that she had moved in with Harper. Seeing her name on my phone screen still stirred something in me, but it wasn't pain, it was more like a quiet ache, the kind you get when you realize how much time has passed. I typed back, wishing her well and sharing a bit about Max and my new routine. She responded warmly, and though the exchange was brief, it felt like the final puzzle piece clicking into place. She was moving forward, and so was I. That night, as Emma and I prepared dinner together, I realized how much my life had changed. The kitchen, once a space that felt cold and unfamiliar after Sarah left, was now warm and alive with the sound of music, laughter, and the sizzle of food on the stove. Emma caught me watching her and grinned. "What?" "Nothing," I said, shaking my head. "Just. I didn't think I'd get here. To this place. With you." She set down the spatula and walked over to me, her expression soft. "I'm glad you did," she said, wrapping her arms around my waist. "You deserve this, Jake." For the first time, I believed her. Months passed, and life began to feel whole again, not in the same way it had with Sarah, but in a way that felt just as meaningful. My days were filled with routines that brought a sense of stability, and my nights were often spent with Emma, whose presence felt like a light that had been missing in my life. One afternoon, while organizing the last of the boxes I'd avoided since Sarah left, I found our wedding album. My initial instinct was to close it, to shove it back into the corner of the closet, but instead, I sat on the floor and flipped through the pages. Each photo brought back memories, her radiant smile, the way we'd laughed during the cake cutting, the way her hand had fit perfectly in mine. The images didn't hurt the way I feared they might. Instead, they reminded me of what we'd shared, the love that had been real even if it hadn't lasted forever. I realized then that holding on to resentment or regret wouldn't serve me. Sarah had been an important part of my life, and her departure had taught me more about myself than I'd thought possible. I picked up the album and placed it carefully back in the box. It wasn't something I needed to display anymore, but it wasn't something I wanted to throw away either. It was part of my story, just like Emma was becoming part of my future. A few weeks later, Sarah and I crossed paths unexpectedly. I was at the park with Max when I spotted her and Harper sitting on a blanket under a tree. Harper was gesturing animatedly as Sarah laughed, her head tilted back, the sound carrying faintly on the breeze. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should approach, but then Sarah saw me and waved. I walked over, Max bounding ahead and charming them instantly. Harper scratched behind his ears while Sarah stood and greeted me with a warm smile. "You look good," she said, her tone genuine. "Thanks," I replied. "So do you." We chatted briefly, just enough to exchange pleasantries and update each other on our lives. Harper was polite and welcoming, and I couldn't help but notice the way she looked at Sarah, with a love that was obvious and sincere. It hurt, but only faintly, like the memory of a long-healed wound. As I walked away, I felt lighter, as though some invisible thread tethering me to the past had finally been cut. I glanced down at Max, who was trotting happily beside me, and smiled. That evening, Emma and I shared dinner on the patio, the warm glow of string lights overhead and Max curled up at our feet. As we sipped wine and talked about our day, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't thought possible a year ago. "Do you ever think about where we'll be in 5 years?" Emma asked, her voice soft and curious. I looked at her, the woman who had shown me that love could be quiet and steady, and smiled. "I try not to think too far ahead," I said, reaching for her hand. "But I know I want you there with me, wherever that is." Her eyes sparkled as she leaned over to kiss me, her lips warm and familiar. In that moment, I felt the truth settle deep in my chest. I had survived the storm, and now I was standing in the sun.